My daughter looked at me and said I was just a burden. After 50 years of working without asking anyone for a dime, I was told I had contributed nothing. I sat in silence, remembering the mortgage I paid, the groceries I stocked, and the $180,000 I quietly gave to her family. She filed a lawsuit to silence me. I didn't fight back in court. Instead, I created a 50-episode podcast. By the time she realized it had reached millions, my voice had already become the voice of thousands, and nothing could take that back. The soup was still warm in my hands when Maggie said it. I had just taken off my coat, the chill of early spring still lingering on my shoulders. She didn't look up from her phone, just stirred her tea with one hand, thumb scrolling with the other, then said it like it was nothing. "You're just kind of here now. I mean, it's not like you're contributing." I didn't speak. Not right away. My grip tightened on the bowl, but my face didn't change. I'd gotten good at that over the years. When you raise a child alone and go through cancer twice without telling anyone, you learn how to hold still while your insides twist. Maggie didn't notice. She was already up, pacing through the living room, half listening to a podcast in her earbuds, tossing words over her shoulder like they wouldn't land. "You've done your part, Mum. But now we're raising kids, paying the bills. It's just different now." I sat down at the small breakfast table, the bowl of lentil soup steamed in front of me, the one I'd made earlier that morning from scratch, the way she used to like it when she was little. I looked around the kitchen. Half of what was in that room, I'd paid for. Not recently, no. But when Maggie and her husband had to move back in 5 years ago, it was my pension that restocked the pantry and kept the lights on during the long, quiet pandemic months. She had forgotten that. Or maybe she had rewritten it. I didn't remind her, not yet. Instead, I listened. To her voice. To the sound of the house breathing around us. The creak of old wood under her socked feet. The faint hum of the fridge I bought. That night, as I folded laundry in the guest room, now mine, I opened the old savings ledger I still kept in a drawer. 17 entries, each marked quietly: rent support, groceries, new tires, a school fundraiser, a bridge loan when her husband's startup fell through. Added up, it was a little over $180,000 across 15 years. I had never asked for it back, never even mentioned most of it. The next morning, her husband Patrick passed by me on the stairs. Didn't say hello, just a nod. Then I heard the words he said to Maggie as he entered the kitchen. "So when is she going to move out? I mean, it's been long enough, right?" That one hit deeper, not because it was said, but because Maggie didn't respond. She didn't defend me. She just changed the subject. And right then, something in me moved. Quietly. Not anger. Not yet. More like a shift in weight. Like the center of gravity inside me relocated. Later that day, I cleared out the old radio from the garage, blew off dust from the microphone I had used during my years managing the local library's reading circle. I plugged it in, just to see if it still worked. The red light flickered, then glowed steady. I didn't say anything into it that day, but I sat in front of it for a long time. You see, when you've lived long enough, there comes a moment, not loud, not dramatic, when you stop asking for a seat at the table, and instead, you build your own. Maggie had called me a burden, but she had no idea who I was before I became her mother, and maybe it was time she learned. The next few weeks passed quietly, but something in the house had changed. Not in the walls or furniture, but in the way I moved through it. I stopped lingering in the kitchen. I stopped asking if anyone needed anything from the store. I stopped volunteering rides or folding the kids' laundry when it piled up in the hallway. They didn't seem to notice. Maggie and Patrick carried on like usual. They rushed the kids out the door each morning, came home tired in the evening, made small talk about work and school and deadlines. I listened from the guest room, where I spent more and more time with the door closed. I still cooked, still cleaned up after myself, but I didn't join them for dinner anymore. It was easier that way. They didn't ask why. One afternoon, while they were both at work and the kids were at a sleepover, I pulled the old filing box from the back of my closet. It was dusty, untouched for years, but everything was still in place. I flipped through old pay stubs, loan agreements, property tax receipts, and a tattered folder marked Sylvia M. Personal Notes. Inside were photocopies of checks I'd written over the years, scribbled thank you notes from Maggie in her 20s, and 2 letters from the bank confirming I'd paid off the last of her college loans in full. I laid everything out on the floor. Then I took photos, one by one, documented each thing. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad anymore. Just clear. That was the word. Clear. Later that night, Patrick made a comment at dinner, not knowing I was passing through the hallway. She's lucky we even let her stay. A lot of people wouldn't. Maggie didn't respond, not with words, but I heard her exhale, long, slow, and exhausted, like she was tired of something but didn't have the strength to name it. Back in my room, I opened my old laptop, the one I used to write book reviews on for the library blog. I typed the first entry of a new document. It wasn't meant for anyone yet. Just for me. I started with a line I hadn't spoken out loud in years. I was 17 when I moved out of my parents' house. I never looked back. From there, the story came naturally. How I worked nights at the diner. How I learned to budget down to the last dime. How I paid for my own classes at the community college by walking 2 miles each morning and saving every coin tip from the counter. I didn't embellish anything. I didn't need to. The truth had its own weight. Each night, I added more. I wrote about the years Maggie was little, how I gave up promotions to be home after school, how I rented textbooks for her classes when she couldn't afford them in college, how I never told her that the emergency savings I used when her husband lost his job was meant for my own retirement. I didn't write with resentment. I wrote to remember. One evening, I walked into the kitchen while Patrick was on a video call in the dining room. He was complaining about the utilities bill, said we needed to cut expenses, that maybe it was time to look into retirement homes. He said it casually, like he was talking about swapping internet plans. But his eyes flicked toward me when I walked in, just for a second. That night, I couldn't sleep, not because I was afraid, but because I knew, finally, that I wasn't imagining it. The way they treated me wasn't about a misunderstanding or miscommunication. It was a slow, deliberate erasure. They wanted me small, quiet, out of the way. The next morning, I ordered a microphone online. 3 days later, it arrived in a brown box, no label, just a barcode. I brought it to my room and set it next to my laptop. I didn't record anything, not yet, but I plugged it in. The red light blinked once, then held steady. I knew what I was going to do. I didn't need to tell anyone, not yet. I waited for a quiet morning. Patrick was already gone for work, and Maggie had taken the kids to school. The house was still, humming like it was holding its breath. I took the small red folder I had prepared over the last few weeks and slipped it under my bed. Inside was a growing collection of notes, screenshots, voice memos, receipts, and photos. None of it was for revenge. It was for clarity. That afternoon, I sat by the window with my old notebook open. I began to map things out. Not in full sentences, just fragments. Little lines of truth that connected over time. The way Maggie's voice changed when she spoke to me versus when she spoke to her friends. The way Patrick always left the room when bills were being discussed. The way their smiles never quite reached their eyes when I offered to help. I started recording too. Not secretly, just carefully. If I was making a grocery run and Maggie commented about how I should be grateful for staying under their roof, I'd take note. If Patrick muttered something under his breath when I walked past him in the hallway, I'd write it down the moment I reached my room. I kept everything in one place, organized, clean. This was not a journal of complaints. It was a map, a quiet one. But maps have power. On Friday evening, while they were out with friends, I opened the microphone again. I read the notes aloud, February 6th. She asked me not to use the front bathroom anymore, said guests might find it strange. February the 13th. Patrick rolled his eyes when I offered to pick up the kids from school, said it was better if I didn't confuse their schedule. February chapter 1. Maggie mentioned a friend of hers whose mother moved into a retirement community, said she was finally living life and not being a burden on her children. The words hit different when spoken out loud. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't hurt, but because crying had become a silent habit long ago. Now I was listening to myself again, and that, in itself, was something. The next day, I opened a new spreadsheet on my laptop. I started with the amount I had contributed during their hard years. Rent, groceries, tuition. I added them all, line by line. I adjusted for inflation where it made sense. By the time I reached the last entry, the total was over $206,000. Next to each amount, I added the date and the reason. I wasn't planning to confront them with it. I just needed to see the math. The truth without emotion. Truth stripped of excuses becomes hard to ignore. Later that week, a package arrived addressed to Maggie. I signed for it at the door. As I turned to leave it on the kitchen counter, the top of the box split open slightly. Inside were glossy brochures, Oak Hill Senior Living. The tagline read, "Life begins at comfort." There were pink and gold balloons printed on the inside flap. Photos of smiling women my age doing watercolor or tending to raised garden beds. It would have been almost sweet if it hadn't felt like a whisper behind my back, a signal not even said out loud. I placed the box exactly where she'd find it. Then I went back to my room. That night, I began the outline for my first podcast episode. I didn't have a title yet, but I knew how it would start. I have always been quiet. Not because I lacked stories, but because I learned early that silence kept peace. Until silence became a cage. Each night after that, I refined the structure. My voice came back slowly like a bird that had forgotten how to fly but still remembered the sky. I didn't tell Maggie or Patrick. I didn't make any changes to my daily routine. I kept cooking simple meals for myself, kept my door closed when they had company, kept my space clean and unnoticeable. But inside, I was gathering, watching, preparing. On a rainy Wednesday, I found Maggie's youngest daughter, Ellie, sitting alone on the stairs with a flashlight. She was reading one of the old library books I had kept from my years of work. She looked up and smiled, said she missed our story nights. I asked if she still liked the tales about women who found their voice. She nodded, and I realized then I wasn't doing all this just for me. I was doing it so that someday Ellie would remember what strength looked like. Not the loud kind, the kind that stays, the kind that builds in silence. When the house was quiet again, I turned on the microphone and spoke. You told me I was invisible, but that's exactly how I made it this far. You didn't see me coming, but I've always been here. That night, I slept with the red folder under my pillow, not out of fear, out of purpose. The living room used to be where we gathered on Sundays. Maggie with her lemon bars, Patrick with his beer, and Ellie always asking to stay up past bedtime. Now it felt like a sterile space where everything had been wiped clean of me. Even the piano I once played sat silent, the keys cold from disuse. That morning I noticed the family calendar had been cleared of my name entirely. No more Mum's book club, no Sylvia's checkup, not even a simple note like Mum's birthday. I stood there with a marker in my hand, paused in front of the fridge, realizing that I had been erased in quiet, deliberate strokes. I turned away, sat at the dining table, and opened my red folder again. The documents were multiplying. I had printed out bank statements, old receipts, photos of the house remodel I helped pay for, and proof of deposits into Ellie's college fund. Patrick used to forward me everything for safekeeping. I archived all of it. Now, every page was a breadcrumb I might need to find my way back to myself. That afternoon, Ellie came home from school carrying a science fair flyer and a frown. Maggie had promised to help her build a solar oven. She cancelled at the last minute for a work thing. Ellie dropped the flyer in front of me and walked upstairs. I looked at the flyer, then at the stack of evidence beside me. For a long moment, I did nothing. Then I quietly picked up my laptop and moved to the guest bedroom. I closed the door behind me. That room, once meant for visiting friends, had slowly become my retreat. The floral wallpaper was faded, but the desk was sturdy. I set the laptop down, clicked open a new audio project, and hit record. My voice at first trembled. This is Sylvia Marchant. I am 69 years old, and I am not a burden. I paused. Then I started over. This is Sylvia Marchant, and if you are listening to this, then maybe you've been made to feel small inside your own home. Maybe you've been told you are too much, too expensive, too in the way. I've been called all of that. But today, I want to tell the truth, from the beginning. I spoke slowly, clearly, letting my story unfold like threads pulled from a hem. I told them about working at the municipal records office since I was 17, about saving up for community college at night, about never asking Patrick or Maggie for help, not even when I broke my wrist and kept cooking dinner with my left hand. By the end of the first recording, my hands were steady. My voice didn't shake. I hit save and named the file Episode 1. Over the next days, the podcast became my discipline. I recorded early in the morning while the house was still. I wrote bullet points on napkins, receipts, scraps of paper. I kept everything in a shoebox under the bed. I didn't tell Ellie. Not yet. Not even when she asked why I had so many index cards by the toaster. Patrick was too busy at work. Maggie came and went like wind, sometimes greeting me, other times brushing past like I was furniture. The less they noticed me, the more I built. By the end of that week, I had 7 episodes drafted. In one, I described how I gave up a promotion to stay close when Patrick went through his rebellious 20s. In another, I remembered how Maggie once cried on my shoulder when her mother was sick, and I held her hand for hours, even though she never called me Mum. These weren't accusations. I told my story as it was. No venom, no dramatics, just truth. Then one evening, something changed. I came downstairs and found Maggie on the phone, pacing near the kitchen. She didn't see me. She was laughing in that clipped, performative way she used when speaking with clients. She said, "I'm honestly surprised she's still here. I thought she'd get the message by now. Patrick says it's just a matter of time." I stood there, my feet heavy, the sound of her voice curling into me like smoke. I didn't confront her. Instead, I went back upstairs, pulled out my notebook, and wrote down the words. I printed them out later and tucked the paper into my red folder. That night, I recorded episode 8. It opened with silence. Then, just my voice. There are moments in life when people think you don't hear, when they speak around you, about you, believing you're too old or too soft or too slow to catch the meaning. But I've always listened, and now I am ready to speak. The more I recorded, the more I remembered. About how I used my emergency savings to keep the mortgage going when Patrick lost his job. About how Maggie's boutique was kept afloat during lockdown because I offered to co-sign their loan. About how they said thank you once, maybe twice, and then rewrote the story in their heads. They began calling their success self-made, as if they built it all from nothing, as if I hadn't built the ground beneath them. I didn't cry that week. Not once. I cooked Ellie's favourite pasta on Friday. She smiled, told me I made it better than her mum. I kissed her on the forehead and said I hoped one day she would learn how to make it even better than me. Saturday morning, I uploaded episode 1. I created a private podcast feed, gave it a title, and added a small black and white photo of me at 21, holding Patrick on my hip. The caption read, "The Invisible Backbone." And for the first time in weeks, I slept soundly through the night. The house was still asleep when I woke up that Sunday. The early light crept through the blinds, casting soft stripes across the carpet. I sat with my coffee in the kitchen, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator, and stared at my phone. The podcast app showed 12 downloads, then 15. By the time the second episode went up that evening, it had reached over 100 plays. I hadn't shared it with anyone. No announcement, no forwarding. The feed was private, but searchable. Maybe someone found it by accident. Maybe a woman like me typed in the words she couldn't say aloud and stumbled across mine. By Wednesday, there were over 600 listeners and 4 emails. I hadn't expected responses. I thought my voice would echo into an empty space, swallowed by the sea of louder, younger, trendier things. But the inbox filled quickly, not just with sympathy, but stories. Women in Iowa, Oregon, even New Jersey. Names I'd never heard, but lives that felt strangely parallel to mine. They wrote things like, "I've been living in the basement of my daughter's house for 3 years. My son's wife calls me by my first name, not grandma. I cashed out my pension to help them buy that house. They never let me forget it." Some sent pictures, old photos of younger versions of themselves, holding babies, standing in front of homes they no longer owned. One woman wrote, "You are saying what we were never allowed to say." I read those words again and again. I didn't feel proud. I felt responsible. This voice I'd kept silent for so long had cracked something open, not just for me, but for others. And I knew now I couldn't turn away from it. I recorded episode 9 that night. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even written. I just sat down, pressed record, and let the truth spill out. That evening, I talked about the ways women my age disappear. Not suddenly, but slowly. A little at a time. How our names vanish from family bills. How people start making decisions around us, never with us. How even the spaces we've cleaned, loved, and protected become rooms we tiptoe through, as if we no longer belong. I talked about the day I stopped buying clothes for myself. The first time Patrick forgot my birthday. The time Maggie introduced me at a neighborhood barbecue as someone who helps around the house. Not her mother-in-law, not Sylvia, just someone. By the time I hit stop, my hands were trembling. Then came Friday. Ellie came home from school with a new drawing in her backpack. It was a family tree. She proudly laid it out on the table, pointing to each branch. Her father, her mother, her grandmother on Maggie's side. Then, on Patrick's side, only one box, labelled Dad's Family. My name was not on it. I didn't cry. I simply picked it up and smiled at her. She said the teacher told them to only write people they lived with. I told her she did it right. That night, I recorded episode 10, and I started it like this. Even your own name can be erased if you let them hold the pen too long. By Saturday, the number of listeners had grown to over 5,000. I started getting messages from daughters and sons, too. Some angry, some ashamed. One young man wrote, "I didn't realize how cruel we were being. I asked my mum to move back in." But something else happened that weekend. I was sitting at the dining table, sorting through old tax files, when Maggie came in holding her phone. She asked if I had a podcast. I said yes. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't throw insults. She simply turned her phone to show a clip. It was my voice, from episode 6, talking about the loan I co-signed for them. She said she didn't remember asking for that Patrick had never told her, that I was making her look bad in front of her clients. I told her the podcast was not about her. She said that didn't matter. People were assuming. People were guessing. Then she asked if I could stop, just for a while, until things calmed down. I said I couldn't. She left the room without another word. That night, I stayed up late reviewing the podcast's legal terms. I made sure I hadn't used real names. I hadn't. I changed Maggie to someone close. I adjusted a few dates, but the truth remained intact. And then, for the first time, I added a donation link. Not for me. I called it the Quiet Women Fund, a small pool of money for elderly women who needed a flight, a deposit, a mattress, something to get them back on their feet. The first donation came in within 2 hours, $50, then 10, then 100. By Sunday, I had 6 emails from women asking for help. 3 of them needed groceries, 1 needed a bus ticket, 1 just wanted someone to call. I called her. Her name was Laverne. She was 73 and living in the back of her nephew's RV. She said she didn't have anything to offer me, but she thanked me for being brave. I told her she was the brave one. That Monday, I sat down to record again. But this time, I didn't start with pain. I started with possibility. It was early morning when I received the first voice message from someone I didn't know. Her name was Ruth. Her voice cracked halfway through the first sentence. She said she had been married for 42 years and had never told anyone what her husband had taken from her. By the end of that day, I had 47 unread messages. I never thought my voice, quiet as it was, would become a thread that pulled so many invisible hands out of the dark. They weren't looking for attention. They weren't chasing outrage. They just needed someone else to say it first. I listened to every message. I read every email. And I cried, quietly, the way women like me were raised to do. When I recorded the next episode, I didn't script anything. I simply sat down with a cup of tea and spoke. I said, "Sometimes strength doesn't look like fire. Sometimes it looks like staying, surviving, swallowing the words because you don't want your children to feel ashamed of where they came from." After that episode went live, a journalist from a small local station reached out. She'd heard the show. She wanted to do a short segment about older women using podcasts to reclaim their voices. I almost said no, not because I was afraid. I was tired. But something about the way she spoke, calm, respectful, made me pause. So I agreed, on one condition: no real names, no addresses, no personal photos. She said that was fine. They filmed it in the library downtown. I wore my old blue cardigan. The lighting was harsh, and I blinked too much. But my voice held steady. I talked about how being needed and being loved are not always the same thing, and how sometimes silence is more damaging than cruelty. The segment aired 3 nights later. Patrick didn't say a word, but Maggie did. She watched it in the kitchen on her tablet while Ellie was at school. She said it was manipulative, that I was milking sympathy. I didn't argue. I only said, if telling the truth makes someone uncomfortable, maybe they were too comfortable in the lie. She called me cruel. I just went back to folding the towels. The next morning, my bank app pinged. It was a donation notification, then another, then 5 more. The Quiet Women Fund had reached $2,800 in just 3 days. I began working with a retired social worker named Elaine. She'd been following the podcast and offered to help vet requests. She said she'd worked in shelters for decades and knew how to spot what was real. I trusted her instantly. We used the money to cover rent for an 81-year-old woman who'd been sleeping in her car. Another portion went to a woman in Arizona who needed a dental procedure she'd been putting off for 5 years. But something was shifting inside my own home. Maggie started speaking to me only when necessary. Patrick stayed later at work. Ellie, sweet child that she was, kept asking if I was famous now. I told her I was just old. Old enough to finally say the truth without shaking. Then, one Saturday morning, while I was watering the azaleas, I noticed the lock on the garage had been changed. I tried my old key. It didn't fit. I waited until dinner and asked Patrick about it. He looked surprised, said it was a safety thing, that a few tools had gone missing, and he wanted to make sure things were secure. I nodded. I didn't ask why I wasn't given a new key, because I already knew. The next day, Maggie took Ellie to a birthday party. Patrick stayed home. He came into the kitchen, sat across from me, and said that things were getting a bit tense around the house. That maybe it would be good for everyone if I took a short trip. I asked if that was his way of asking me to leave. He didn't answer. He just stood up and said, "Think about it. A little break might do you some good." That night, I recorded again. I didn't mention names. I didn't even describe the conversation. I just said this. You can live in a house for years and still find yourself a guest the moment you stop serving the tea. I ended the episode with a soft breath and a simple sentence. But guests can leave too. The next morning, I booked a room at a quiet bed and breakfast near the water. Just for a weekend. I didn't tell anyone. I packed 1 suitcase, 2 books, and my old tape recorder. I left a note on the kitchen counter. Nothing dramatic. Just taking a few days to breathe. No one called. No one texted. But the silence was more honest than any apology they might have sent. I sat by the shore that evening, feeling the wind press against my skin, and I remembered something my grandmother used to say. A woman's voice grows stronger the longer she is ignored. And that night, my voice felt like thunder. The ocean air felt like an old friend. Gentle. Honest. I spent 3 mornings in that little coastal inn, waking up with the sun and walking barefoot along the water. I left my phone on the nightstand. I didn't check messages. I didn't want to know who had noticed I was gone and who hadn't. By the second night, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going back to live in fear of being erased inside my own home. I had built a life on dignity. If that made some people uncomfortable, then maybe they never understood me in the first place. When I returned, the kitchen was spotless. The note I had left was gone. There was no mention of my absence. Patrick didn't speak to me. Maggie barely looked in my direction. Ellie gave me a shy hug and asked if I brought her a seashell. I had. And that hug, that little arm around my waist, reminded me why I had stayed as long as I did. That night, when the house was quiet, I opened my laptop and logged into the fund account. It had reached nearly $9,000. But that wasn't the number that mattered most to me anymore. I opened a second tab and pulled up the folder I had saved weeks earlier. Inside were PDFs of bank statements, deed records, and the most important file of all, my trust documents. Long before I ever moved in with Patrick and Maggie, I had worked with a quiet, brilliant attorney named Grace Talbot. We met through a church women's circle, and over tea one afternoon, she told me that women like us needed more than a will. We needed structure, protection. I took her advice. With Grace's help, I had created a living trust that held everything I owned, my pension account, the life insurance policy from Harold, and the mineral rights from my father's land in Nebraska. It wasn't flashy, but it was real. And most importantly, no one could touch it without me. I had also included language that allowed me to amend the trust without notifying any named parties. Grace called it my quiet firewall. I just thought of it as peace of mind. I had spent years unsure if I'd ever need it. But now, with the look in Patrick's eyes growing colder each week, I knew exactly why Grace had insisted I be ready. I drafted an update that night. The new version included a grant to the Quiet Women Fund. A full 60% of my assets would go directly into the foundation upon my passing. The rest would be split between 3 community programs: an adult literacy initiative, a senior housing cooperative, and a mobile legal aid clinic for women over 60. Patrick and Maggie were no longer named in the document. It wasn't revenge, it was protection of the life I had lived, of the people I wanted to help, of the dignity I refused to surrender. The next morning, I took a walk to the downtown post office and mailed the amendment to Grace. Certified and tracked. I made sure of it. Later that day, while sipping tea on the porch, I noticed Patrick pacing in the driveway. He was holding a piece of paper, talking fast on the phone. From where I sat, I could hear only fragments. Something about the deed, about refinancing. He slammed the car door and drove off. That evening, Maggie asked if I had been messing around with anything legal. I told her no lies. I said I was taking steps to ensure the rest of my years meant something. She scoffed, told me I was making things harder than they needed to be. I didn't respond. I was done explaining myself. The house felt colder that night. I wore socks to bed and left the nightlight on. Not out of fear, but because I needed to see clearly. The next morning, Patrick dropped a manila envelope in front of me during breakfast. Inside were papers from a realtor, a listing agreement. The house was going up for sale. He said they needed space, that the city felt cramped, that it was time for a new chapter. I nodded. Then I told him I'd be moving out before the end of the week. Maggie looked shocked. Patrick asked where I'd go. I told them the truth. I had signed a 6-month lease at the little coastal inn. The owner, a widow herself, had offered me a long-term rate after I told her about the podcast. I'd have my own kitchenette, a small garden space, and, best of all, quiet. They didn't believe me. So I packed my bags that afternoon. I left behind nothing but the echo of my footsteps down the hall. Ellie cried when I hugged her goodbye. I kissed her cheek and whispered to her that truth is never something to fear. When I closed the front door for the last time, I didn't feel sad. I felt empty, in a good way, like a room after the clutter is cleared, like air after a storm. Back at the inn, I unpacked slowly, set up my mic, plugged in the recorder. That night, I spoke not as someone broken, but as someone who had finally gathered every scattered piece of herself. And in the quiet that followed, I realized something. I was no longer afraid of being invisible, because this time, I had made myself seen. 3 weeks passed. At the inn, life found a rhythm I didn't know I'd been craving. I walked to the pier every morning. I brewed coffee slowly, read the newspaper cover to cover, and recorded episodes for the podcast in the hush of the afternoon. Each time I sat behind the mic, I wasn't just talking to strangers. I was reclaiming the sound of my own voice, one story at a time. But silence, like glass, can shatter. It was a Thursday, grey sky, soft wind. I had just finished editing a story from a retired nurse in Wisconsin when I noticed the blinking light on my phone. 2 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize, and 1 voicemail. It was Ellie. Her voice was tiny, like she was whispering in a closet. "Grandma," she said, "Daddy says you're not allowed to talk to me anymore. Mummy said you did something bad, but I know you didn't. I just wanted to tell you that I miss you." The message ended with a sniffle. I sat perfectly still for a full minute, then played it again and again. Then I called Grace. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what I'd heard. I told her about the realtor papers. I told her that Patrick and Maggie were trying to scrub me out of Ellie's world. Grace was quiet for a moment, then said, "Sylvia, I think it's time." Time for what? I already knew. We had talked about it once before, in passing. An option that would turn private heartbreak into public clarity. I told her to proceed. By Monday morning, the notice was filed. 3 days later, Maggie showed up at the inn. She didn't knock, just barged into the courtyard while I was trimming the potted herbs. She looked different, exhausted, makeup smeared. Her voice was sharp, but not steady. She said Patrick had been trying to refinance the house, but something flagged during the review. The bank had reached out to her, asked about the trust, about my name still being on certain documents. I said nothing. She kept talking. She said Patrick had taken out a personal loan in her name, without telling her. $32,000. Gone. She wanted to know if I had known. I told her no. Then I told her what I had done, that I had updated the trust, that my name was removed from the deed months ago, that I had protected everything not to punish them, but to survive them. Her face twisted. She called me selfish, cold, said I was turning her daughter against her. I didn't flinch. I reminded her that I had spent years holding my tongue so Ellie could grow up in peace, that I had accepted small cruelties in silence, but not anymore. She left without saying goodbye. 2 nights later, Patrick called. I let it ring. Then the texts came, one after another. He accused me of betrayal, of manipulating Ellie, of ruining everything. He said I had become ungrateful, that I owed him, that without him I would have rotted alone in a nursing home. I read every word, then I blocked his number. That night, I cried, not from regret, but from the weight of release. The next morning, I opened my inbox. There was a message from a producer at a local radio station. She had heard my podcast, said it had made the rounds in a few senior circles, that she wanted to feature me on a short segment called Quiet Strength. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I wrote back. I said yes. The interview aired 2 weeks later. I wore my green sweater and brushed my hair into a soft bun. I didn't say anything cruel. I didn't name names. I just told the truth. That sometimes family isn't where you came from, but where you find yourself safe. That sometimes the most radical thing a woman can do is protect her peace. A week after the broadcast, the Quiet Women Fund tripled in donations. I received over 200 emails from women who said they had been waiting for someone to speak what they had never dared to say aloud. One email stood out. It was from a woman in Arizona. She said her grandson had called her crazy for wanting to set up a trust, that her daughter-in-law had told her she didn't need her stories or her savings, just her silence. She wrote, "But after hearing you, I know now I am not alone, and I am not wrong." I printed her message and taped it above my writing desk. That night, I recorded a new episode. This one wasn't a story. It was a reminder. To every woman who ever felt erased in her own kitchen, to every grandmother told to stay quiet, to every mother asked to sacrifice until there was nothing left. I spoke directly to them, and when I hit stop, I knew this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning, not just of healing, but of visibility. The next day, I planted tomatoes in the courtyard. I watched the wind stir the ocean, and for the first time in a long, long while, I felt rooted, not in a house, not in a title, but in truth. It was a Wednesday morning when I received the email from Grace. The subject line was simple, urgent, read now. Inside was a forwarded message chain between the Quiet Women Fund Board and a loan officer from a private capital group in Austin. Apparently, someone had applied for a bridge loan using a forged letter of endorsement. A letter that claimed the Quiet Women Fund backed a new non-profit initiative focused on veteran widow assistance. The signature at the bottom of the fake letter was mine, except I had never signed it. Grace had flagged it immediately. The language was clumsy. It used phrasing I never used. She asked the fund's legal team to investigate. The request for the loan had come from a man named Patrick Warner, my son. He had used my name, my credibility, my mission, all to secure a loan for a business that didn't exist. Grace called me that afternoon. She didn't shout. She didn't panic. She just asked plainly what I wanted to do. I told her I needed one day, not to decide. I already knew what I would do. But I needed a day to walk through the pier, to speak my truth into the wind, to whisper apologies to every woman who ever trusted my voice and might now see it dragged through the mud. The next morning I called Grace. We filed the paperwork, formal cease and desist, demand for investigation, notice of fraud. I wasn't trying to destroy Patrick, but I would not let him destroy what I had rebuilt. That evening, I received a voicemail. It was Patrick's voice. He didn't apologize. He accused me of betrayal, said I had turned Ellie against him, that Grace had poisoned me, that I had always loved the spotlight more than I loved my family. His voice cracked once. Then he said something I'll never forget. "You were supposed to fade quietly, Mom. You were supposed to make room, not take it." I sat with that sentence for a long time. All my life, I had made room. For my husband, for my children, for everyone else's comfort. But not anymore. 2 weeks later, the legal notice went public. The story was picked up by 2 advocacy newsletters and 1 national podcast focused on elder abuse and financial fraud. The headline didn't use Patrick's name. It didn't need to. It focused on a broader truth: how adult children can weaponize trust, how women over 70 are the most vulnerable group in private fraud schemes, how silence is often the most expensive currency. Ellie called me that night. She said Daddy was angry all the time now, that Mommy had stopped coming to her school plays, that sometimes she just wanted to come live with me at the inn. I didn't tell her about the court papers. I didn't mention the forged letter. I just told her she was loved, and that the truth always has a way of finding light. The next morning I brewed coffee and sat on the porch. The sun hit the water in quiet gold streaks. Grace arrived just after 9. She brought with her a small stack of envelopes, letters from donors, from podcast listeners, from 2 women who had met each other through the Quiet Women Fund and were now opening their own resource center in Maine. One note was from a woman who said she had been scammed out of her pension by her own daughter. She wrote that hearing my story had stopped her from signing over her house. that she had walked into a senior legal clinic and for the first time asked for help, that she had started over, that she was no longer afraid to say no. I sat with those letters all afternoon. Each word was a mirror, not of who I had been, but of who I had become. Later that week, I was invited to speak at a panel in Atlanta on financial safety for women over 65. I hesitated. Then I said yes. On stage, under soft lights, I shared the timeline. I talked about forgiveness and boundaries, about love that doesn't require silence, about family that sometimes becomes a wound, not a home. I ended with this. Sometimes, the most powerful thing a woman can do is to write her own ending, to close a door, not in bitterness, but in peace. To say, I am not who you say I am more. After the panel, an older woman in a dark blue coat came up to me. She didn't speak at first. She just hugged me. Then she whispered, "Thank you for not fading." The fall air had started to cool the mornings, crisp enough that I wore my long cardigan out on the porch. I sat with my notebook, tracing the same sentence over and over without realizing it. I am not who you say I am. I had said it on stage in Atlanta, but now it rang differently, not like a declaration, more like a quiet truth that no longer needed to be defended. That day, I received a letter in a pale grey envelope. No return address. Inside was a note. Short. Precise. It said, "You think you've won, but all you've done is make sure your name is dragged through the same mud you built your fake legacy on. No signature." But I knew the handwriting. Samantha. The words stung, not because they were true, but because they confirmed what I had feared since the legal papers went public. That Samantha and Patrick were circling each other again. That whatever lines she had drawn, she had already erased. That night, I sat at the dinner table alone. I remembered the years I spent making extra servings, leaving the light on, waiting for Patrick to show up even after I knew he wouldn't. I did not cry. I got up, put the plate in the sink, and walked out to the dock. The moonlight spread across the water like silver lace. I stood there until my feet numbed, until the silence felt like company. The next morning, Grace brought news. The Quiet Women Fund had been awarded a discretionary grant from a large foundation. It was enough to expand into 2 new states, enough to hire staff full-time, enough to launch the curriculum we'd been designing for rural community centers. She smiled when she told me, but I could see the hesitation in her eyes. She was worried about the media blowback, that Samantha or someone in Patrick's circle would twist the press. I told her to move forward anyway. If I had learned anything in the last year, it was this. Standing still to avoid being judged is just another kind of silence. The press did come. A tabloid ran a small piece about me. It misquoted several facts. It suggested the foundation was using pity for profit. It featured a blurry photo of me at the courthouse steps. Grace wanted to issue a rebuttal. I told her not to. Instead, I made a quiet post on the foundation's blog. It was titled, "What Legacy Means When No One's Watching." I didn't name names. I just spoke about resilience, about what it means to start over in your 70s, about how integrity is not loud, but it is steady. The post was shared over 10,000 times in 3 days. And then, the unexpected happened. Ellie showed up at the inn. She wasn't alone. She was with her father. Patrick looked thinner than I remembered. Not physically frail, but diminished. Like something inside him had sunk too deep to reach again. He didn't ask to come inside. He just stood beside his daughter and said he wanted her to see where she came from. Then he left. Ellie stayed. She walked through the guest rooms, asked about the herb garden, asked if I still used the big copper kettle for soup. We sat on the porch swing, and she rested her head on my shoulder the way she did when she was 5. She said, "Mommy told me you don't forgive people who lie." I told her, "I forgive people who stop lying." That night, I tucked her into the guest room, and when I closed the door, I felt something unspoken settle inside me. Not closure, but clarity. The next morning, I opened the letter I had been keeping sealed for 3 weeks. It was from the foundation director who had sponsored the grant. He said they were inspired by my courage, that they believed older women were the cornerstone of healthy communities, that the future of safety and education belonged in the hands of women who had survived more than they had ever spoken aloud. There was an invitation at the bottom of the page. Would I consider serving as an advisor on the foundation's board? I folded the letter slowly. I didn't smile. I just breathed. After breakfast, I walked Ellie through the pier again. She asked if the birds always flew that low. I said no, only when they trust the water. That afternoon, Patrick came to pick her up. He didn't say thank you, but he didn't look away either. And that was enough, not for reconciliation, but for truth. That night, I sat at the same kitchen table. I didn't set 2 places, but I didn't feel alone. There is a certain kind of peace that comes when the storm doesn't pass, but you learn to live with the rain. That was the peace I felt. I was no longer fighting to be seen. I was simply living without hiding. And in that quiet, something like strength took root again. By late October, the air had shifted, not just in temperature, but in weight. The days had grown shorter, and the early sunsets painted everything in soft gold and quiet blue. The inn felt fuller, warmer somehow, even when it was empty. I moved slower, but not from age, from a calm I hadn't known in years. I received an email that morning from Grace. She had just wrapped a workshop in Tennessee and attached a picture. A room of women, most older than me, sitting in folding chairs, listening with eyes that understood too much. She wrote, "They don't just come for safety. They come for language, for names for what they lived through." I stared at the photo longer than I meant to. It reminded me of a time, decades ago, when I didn't have the words either, only the ache. Later that day, I sat down with my attorney. I had been avoiding this meeting, but it was time. The trust papers were ready. I had decided to restructure the ownership of the inn, not to protect it from others, but to free myself from the fear of losing it. The property would go to a collective non-profit board upon my passing, not to Patrick, not to Samantha, not even to Ellie. She would inherit other things, of course, personal things, but not this house, not the land. This space was built from the soil of my survival. It had to outlive me as something more than inheritance. It had to become intention. The attorney looked over the signatures carefully and asked if I wanted to notify my son. I shook my head. Let the silence say what words could not. That evening, a woman named Florence checked into room 6. She looked exhausted, carried no luggage, only a purse and a canvas tote. I noticed a bruise on her forearm but said nothing. I offered her warm cider, and she nodded. We sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the trees. She didn't speak much, just watched the light shift across the lake. When she finally did speak, it was soft, almost casual. She said she had been living in her car for 2 weeks, said her son had gotten into trouble, and she was the one left to clean up the mess. Not with money, but with silence. She said she found the Quiet Women Fund online by accident. Then she looked at me and asked if this place was real. I told her it was. I said it wasn't a shelter, but it was a beginning. She nodded again. I showed her the kitchen, the extra toiletries, the garden behind the kitchen where the rosemary always grew wild. She didn't cry, and I didn't make her. That was the rule here. We don't rescue. We don't fix. We just witness. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. In the morning, Florence helped me bring in the porch chairs. Then she asked if she could stay on to help clean rooms, just for a few days. I said yes, not because I needed the help, but because she needed to be needed. 2 days later, I got a phone call. From Ellie. She said she had a school project about women who made a difference. She wanted to interview me. I told her I wasn't anyone special. She said, "You taught me to say no." That afternoon, she arrived with her school notebook and pink pen. We sat at the kitchen table, just like we had when she was a toddler coloring shapes while I baked bread. She asked me questions about my childhood, about the first time I had spoken up, about what it felt like to build something on my own. I answered each question honestly, but carefully. Not to protect her, but to honor the path I had taken. Before she left, she asked if she could visit more often. I told her the door was always open. She smiled, and for the first time in months, I saw something behind her eyes that wasn't confusion or sadness. I saw recognition. Later that week, I sat down to draft a letter to Grace. I told her we had room to grow the program, that the soil was good, that the women were coming, one by one, that the silence was breaking, and I was ready, not for attention, not for redemption, but for what came next. Because what came next was mine to decide. It had been raining all night, a slow, steady drizzle that made the world quieter than usual. I stepped outside just before dawn, cup of black coffee warming my hands, and stood on the back porch of the inn. The lake was wrapped in fog, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to plan the next move. The inn no longer belonged just to me. It belonged to every woman who had crossed the threshold with nothing but the courage to begin again. Inside, the lights in the kitchen flicked on. Florence. She had taken to baking in the mornings, not to serve guests, just to fill the air with something that felt like care. Banana bread this time. I could smell the cinnamon and butter. She had told me she might stay through winter. I said nothing then, but I hoped she would. By noon, Grace had arrived. She was early, as always, and brought with her the finalized partnership proposal. Our network of quiet women inns would be official, registered, recognized, funded. She placed the documents on the dining table, and we read through every word like it was scripture. I signed the papers slowly, not from hesitation, but reverence. Then she handed me an envelope. On the outside, a sticky note in Ellie's handwriting. For Grandma, when she's ready. Inside was a drawing. It was of the inn, but not the way it looked now. The garden was bigger. There were 3 cabins out back, a glass greenhouse, a wooden sign that read, "The Quiet House." At the bottom, Ellie had written in pink pen, "I want to be part of this someday." I held that piece of paper longer than anything I'd held in years. That afternoon, I walked to the edge of the lake. The fog had lifted. The water shimmered with late autumn sunlight. I thought of every version of myself that had stood here. The young girl who ran away, the mother who stayed too long, the woman who finally left, and the one who built something from all of it. Patrick never called again. I didn't expect him to. The truth was, I no longer needed an ending from him. Some silences weren't meant to be broken. At sundown, I lit the fire pit in the backyard. Grace and I sat beside it, wrapped in old quilts, sipping cider. She asked if I felt proud. I said I felt whole. That night, as the guests settled into their rooms, I stood once more at the top of the stairs, listening. The house creaked in familiar ways. Someone laughed softly in the hallway. A kettle whistled. It all sounded like home. Not the home I had lost, the home I had chosen, the home I had made. If you've ever been left out of your own family, if your silence was mistaken for weakness, if you've ever had to rebuild from the ruins of someone else's decisions, then maybe this story touched a part of you too. I hope you felt seen. I hope you know it's never too late to come back to yourself. If this story stayed with you, leave a quiet heart below. Let others know they're not the only ones starting over.